The sun was setting over the New Mexico territory when Daniel Crawford heard the crying. He'd been tracking a wounded elk for 3 hours, following blood drops through the scrub brush and red dirt, focused so completely on the hunt that he almost missed it. A soft, desperate sobbing coming from somewhere beyond the ridge. Daniel froze, his hand tightening on his rifle. This was 1849, a year when the territory was split between Mexican settlers, American homesteaders, and Apache tribes who'd been here long before either group arrived. And out here, 50 miles from the nearest settlement, strange sounds usually meant danger. He was 26 years old, unmarried, running a small ranch that barely kept him fed. His father had claimed this land 5 years ago, built a modest cabin, started raising cattle. Then cholera had swept through during the summer of '47, taking both his parents within a week of each other. Daniel had been managing alone ever since, learning the hard way that the frontier showed no mercy to the unprepared. He'd survived Apache raids, drought, flash floods, and winters that killed half his herd. He'd learned to be careful, to be suspicious, to treat every unknown as a potential threat. But that crying, it wasn't the sound of a trap or an ambush. It was the sound of genuine distress. Young, female, absolutely terrified. Daniel's conscience warred with his survival instincts for about 10 seconds before conscience won. He left the elk trail and climbed the ridge, moving quietly through the sagebrush, rifle ready. What he found on the other side made him stop dead in his tracks. A young Apache woman, maybe 18 or 19 years old, sat huddled against a boulder. Her dress was torn, her face scratched and bleeding, one ankle swollen to twice its normal size. She was crying with the kind of helpless desperation that came from being lost, hurt, and completely alone. When she saw Daniel, she tried to scramble backward, her eyes going wide with terror. She said something in Apache, her voice high and panicked, her hands raised defensively. Daniel could see she expected him to shoot her, or worse, most white men would. Finding a lone Apache woman was like stumbling onto a gold nugget. Some men would take her captive, sell her, use her. The darker possibilities made Daniel's stomach turn. He slowly lowered his rifle, raised both hands to show they were empty. "It's all right," he said softly, knowing she probably didn't understand English but hoping his tone would convey his meaning. "I'm not going to hurt you." The woman stared at him, her chest heaving with frightened breaths. She said something else in Apache, pointing to her swollen ankle, then gesturing toward the horizon. Daniel understood. She was lost. She was injured. She needed help. And every minute she spent out here alone, as darkness fell and the temperature dropped, decreased her chances of survival. The smart thing would be to walk away, pretend he never saw her, let nature take its course. Getting involved with Apache troubles was a quick way to end up dead, or worse, starting a war that would get his neighbors killed too. But Daniel had been raised by good Christian parents who'd taught him that every life had value, regardless of skin color. And looking at this terrified young woman, he couldn't see an enemy. He just saw someone who needed help. He approached slowly, carefully, like you'd approach a wounded animal. The woman tensed, but didn't try to run. Her ankle wouldn't let her even if she wanted to. Daniel knelt a few feet away and pointed to himself. "Daniel!" Then he pointed to her ankle and gestured toward his cabin, visible in the valley below. "Help? Medical? Safe?" The woman's dark eyes searched his face, looking for deception, for danger, for any sign that this was a trap. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly and spoke a single word that sounded like a name. "Ayanna." Daniel smiled despite the situation. "Ayanna. Pretty name." He offered his hand to help her stand. She hesitated for a long moment before taking it. Her hand was small and calloused, the hand of someone who worked hard every day. When she tried to put weight on her injured ankle, she gasped in pain and would have fallen if Daniel hadn't caught her. This was going to be a problem. His cabin was a good mile away, mostly downhill, but still rough terrain. She couldn't walk it. Daniel made a quick decision. He turned his back to her and gestured for her to climb on. A piggyback ride was undignified, but it was the only way to get her to shelter before dark. Ayanna understood. She climbed onto his back, her arms wrapping around his shoulders, her weight slight but present. Daniel stood carefully and started walking toward his cabin, very aware that he just made a choice that could change his life forever. The walk took 40 minutes. By the time they reached the cabin, full dark had fallen and the temperature was dropping fast. Desert nights in October could be brutal, dropping from 70 degrees to near freezing in a matter of hours. Daniel's cabin was small but solid. One room with a fireplace, a bed, a table, and not much else. He set Ayanna down in the single chair and immediately started building up the fire. She watched him warily, her body tense like a rabbit ready to bolt. Daniel understood. She was in a strange man's cabin, completely vulnerable, with no idea what his intentions were. He needed to establish trust quickly. He pointed to the bed, then to her, then to himself and the floor. She could have the bed. He'd sleep on the ground. It was the only bed, his only comfortable sleeping spot, but she needed it more than he did. Ayanna's eyes widened slightly. She said something in Apache that sounded like a question. Daniel just nodded firmly and repeated the gesture. Bed, you, floor, me. Then he turned his attention to her ankle. It was badly swollen, probably sprained, maybe broken. He had some basic medical supplies, things his mother had taught him to use. He heated water, tore strips from an old shirt for bandages, and approached Ayanna carefully. She watched him prepare the supplies, and when he knelt before her to examine her ankle, she flinched but didn't pull away. Daniel worked as gently as he could, removing her worn moccasin, feeling the bones carefully, determining that it was a bad sprain but probably not broken. He soaked the bandages in cool water and wrapped her ankle carefully, the way his mother had taught him. The whole time Ayanna watched his face with an expression somewhere between confusion and cautious trust. When he finished, he stood and backed away, giving her space. She tested the bandage carefully, then looked up at him and said something in Apache. Her tone was softer now, less afraid. Daniel wished desperately that he could understand her. He'd picked up a few Spanish words from Mexican traders, but Apache was completely foreign to him. They communicated through gestures and tone, and somehow it worked. Daniel prepared a simple meal, cornbread and beans with some dried beef. Nothing fancy, but it was warm and filling. He gave Ayanna the larger portion, noting how hungry she seemed, how quickly she ate. She'd probably been lost for at least a day, maybe more, with nothing to eat. After they ate, Daniel gestured to the bed again. Ayanna shook her head and said something, pointing to him, then to the bed. She was arguing that he should take his own bed. Daniel almost smiled. Even terrified and injured in a stranger's cabin, she had pride and manners. He shook his head firmly. You're hurt. You need rest. Take the bed. They went back and forth like this for a few minutes, a strange negotiation conducted entirely in gestures, until finally Ayanna relented. She limped to the bed, sat down carefully, and looked at Daniel with an expression that was hard to read. Then she did something that surprised him. She patted the space next to her on the bed and said something in Apache, her tone making it clear this was a question, an offer. Daniel's face went hot. He understood what she was offering, or thought he did. The bed was big enough for two people if they stayed on opposite sides. It would be warmer, more comfortable for both of them. But sleeping in the same bed with an unmarried Apache woman, even innocently, could be seen as something very different by her people. Could be seen as dishonor, as taking advantage, as something that would demand consequences. He shook his head firmly and pointed to the floor. I'll be fine here. Thank you, but no. Ayanna looked hurt, then embarrassed. She said something else in Apache, her tone apologetic, and turned away to face the wall. Daniel felt terrible. He'd just refused her attempt at gratitude, at sharing, at treating him as something other than a threat. He wanted to explain, to tell her that he was refusing out of respect, not rejection. But he had no words she would understand. So he just built up the fire higher, arranged his bedroll on the floor, and tried to make himself comfortable on the hard wooden boards. The night was long and awkward. Daniel lay awake for hours, listening to Ayanna's breathing, making sure she was all right, fighting the loneliness that had been his constant companion since his parents died. He'd been alone in this cabin for 2 years now, alone with his cattle and his struggles and his slowly dying hope of ever having a family. And now there was a woman in his bed, beautiful despite her injuries, kind despite her fear. And he was sleeping on the floor because getting involved with her world could start a war. Somewhere around midnight, Ayanna started crying softly. Daniel sat up, concerned. She was asleep, he realized, dreaming, probably reliving whatever had happened to get her lost and injured. He wanted to comfort her but had no idea how. He settled for speaking softly in English, nonsense words of comfort, the kind you'd use with a frightened animal. It's all right. You're safe here. Nobody's going to hurt you. I promise." Somehow, his voice seemed to calm her. The crying stopped, her breathing evened out, and she slept peacefully for the rest of the night. Daniel lay back down, staring at the ceiling, wondering what the hell he'd gotten himself into. Morning came cold and bright. Daniel woke to find Ayanna already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, testing her ankle carefully. She looked better after a night of rest, the terror gone from her eyes, replaced with thoughtful calculation. When she saw Daniel stirring, she spoke to him in Apache, her tone suggesting questions. Daniel sat up and tried to communicate through gestures. He needed to know where her people were, how to return her safely. The last thing he wanted was to be found with her in his cabin, looking like he'd taken her captive. Ayanna seemed to understand. She pointed toward the mountains to the east, made a gesture that suggested many people, then held up fingers, trying to indicate distance maybe, or time. Daniel guessed her village was in the mountains, probably a day's ride away. The problem was, he couldn't take her there. Riding into an Apache camp as a white man was suicide unless you were invited, and he definitely wasn't invited. He tried to explain this through gestures, pointing to himself, then to the mountains, then making a throat-cutting motion. Ayanna's eyes widened. She understood. She said something in Apache, her expression troubled. They were stuck. She couldn't walk home on that ankle, and he couldn't safely take her there. They'd have to wait for her people to find her, which could take days, or weeks, or never. Daniel made breakfast, more cornbread and some eggs from his chickens. They ate in awkward silence, both trying to figure out what to do next. That's when they heard it. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses coming fast. If you're enjoying this story of an impossible situation in the Old West, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will shock you. Daniel grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. What he saw made his blood run cold. At least a dozen Apache warriors on horseback, riding hard toward his cabin. They'd found her trail somehow, tracked her here, and now they were coming for her, and possibly for him. Ayanna limped to the window, saw the riders, and her face lit up with relief and joy. She said something in Apache that sounded like names, pointing to specific riders, her people, her family, coming to rescue her. But to them, Daniel realized with growing dread, it would look like he'd taken her captive. Like he'd spent the night with her in his cabin, alone, doing God knows what. The warriors would kill him on sight. They'd burn his cabin. They'd assume the worst because that's what white men usually did to Apache women they found alone. Ayanna seemed to realize this at the same moment. Her expression changed from joy to panic. She grabbed Daniel's arm and said something urgently in Apache, pointing to him, then to herself, then making gestures he didn't understand. She was trying to tell him something important, trying to explain something that might save his life, but he had no idea what. The warriors were close now, close enough that Daniel could see the war paint on their faces, the weapons in their hands. Ayanna made a desperate decision. She grabbed Daniel's face with both hands, forced him to look directly at her, and said one word in English, carefully pronounced as if she'd been practicing it all night. Husband. Daniel's mind went blank. Husband. She was going to tell them he was her husband, that they were married, that everything that happened in this cabin was legitimate, honorable, consensual. It was a lie, but it was a lie that might save his life. The warriors were at the door now, dismounting, weapons ready. Daniel had about 3 seconds to decide if he was going to play along with this deception or tell the truth and probably die. He made his choice. He pulled Ayanna close, wrapping his arms around her in a protective embrace that anyone watching would recognize as intimate, familiar. She leaned into him, relief evident on her face. The door burst open. 6 Apache warriors flooded into the cabin, weapons raised, faces painted for war. They saw Ayanna in Daniel's arms and stopped cold. One of them, an older warrior with scars across his chest, lowered his weapon and spoke rapidly in Apache. His tone was confused, questioning. Ayanna responded in the same language, her voice calm and clear. She gestured to Daniel, to herself, to the cabin, telling a story Daniel couldn't understand but desperately hoped was convincing. The scarred warrior's expression changed from rage to confusion to something that looked almost like amusement. He said something to the other warriors, who slowly lowered their weapons, though they still watched Daniel with undisguised suspicion. Then the warrior turned to Daniel and spoke in broken English. You, Mary, My daughter? The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Daughter. Ayanna was this warrior's daughter, and he thought Daniel had married her. Daniel's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He looked at Ayanna, who nodded encouragingly, her eyes pleading with him to play along. To accept this lie that had spiraled completely out of control? Yes, Daniel heard himself say, "We are married. She was lost. I found her. I helped her. We are married now." The lie tasted bitter on his tongue, but it was too late to take back. The warrior studied Daniel's face for a long moment, searching for deception. Then he looked at his daughter, asked her something in Apache. Ayanna responded firmly, without hesitation, her hand finding Daniel's and squeezing tight. The warrior's expression softened. He said something to the other warriors, who relaxed their postures, some even smiling. Then he turned back to Daniel and did something completely unexpected. He clasped Daniel's shoulder in what appeared to be a gesture of respect, spoke a long string of Apache words, and then said in English, "Good. You. Take care. My daughter?" Daniel nodded, not trusting his voice. The warriors began leaving, mounting their horses, apparently satisfied with what they'd found. But before the scarred warrior left, he turned back to Daniel and said something that made Daniel's stomach drop. 1 week, we come back, bring gifts, celebrate marriage. Then he was gone, and Daniel was left standing in his cabin with Ayanna, who had just told her father they were married, and who was looking at Daniel with an expression somewhere between gratitude and terror. They stood in silence for a long moment after the warriors left, the dust from their horses slowly settling outside. Daniel's mind was racing. What the hell had just happened? He'd gone from bachelor rancher to married man in the span of a single lie. A lie told to save his life? Yes, but still a lie. And in 1 week, Ayanna's entire tribe was going to show up expecting a wedding celebration. He looked at Ayanna, who was watching him nervously. She said something in Apache, her tone apologetic. Daniel shook his head. "It's not your fault. You saved my life." Those words were true. If she hadn't claimed him as her husband, he'd probably be dead right now. But what were they supposed to do now? Ayanna limped to the table and sat down heavily. She looked exhausted, the brief joy of seeing her people replaced by obvious worry. She gestured to herself, then to Daniel, then made a motion like breaking something apart. She was asking if he wanted her to leave, to break the lie, to tell her father the truth. Daniel thought about it seriously. If she went back and told the truth now, he'd probably be fine. They'd be angry she lied, but they wouldn't kill him. He'd just be the white rancher who helped a lost Apache girl, nothing more. But Ayanna wouldn't be fine. She'd lied to her father, a chief by the looks of him. She'd dishonored herself by spending the night alone with a man. In Apache culture, that probably meant she was unmarried forever, damaged goods. The thought made Daniel angry. She'd done nothing wrong, she'd been lost and hurt, and he'd helped her, and now she was facing consequences for something that was entirely innocent. "No," Daniel said firmly. He pointed to her, then to himself, then made a gesture like joining hands. "We stay married. For now. We figure this out together." Ayanna's eyes widened. She said something in Apache that sounded like a question, her expression hopeful but uncertain. Daniel had no idea what he was agreeing to. He knew nothing about Apache marriage customs, about what would be expected of him, about whether this would be permanent or if there was some way to respectfully end it later. But looking at this young woman who had trusted him with her safety, who had lied to protect him from her own people, he knew he couldn't abandon her now. The next week was the strangest of Daniel's life. Ayanna couldn't leave, her ankle still too injured to walk the distance home. So she stayed in his cabin, and they developed a routine that was part practical necessity and part awkward dance around their fake marriage. She slept in the bed. He slept on the floor. She cooked Apache dishes with his limited supplies, creating meals that were surprisingly delicious. He worked the ranch, tended the cattle, tried to prepare for whatever was coming in 7 days. They communicated through a growing vocabulary of shared words and gestures. Ayanna taught him Apache words. He taught her English. By the 3rd day, they could have basic conversations, halting and full of misunderstandings, but conversations nonetheless. Daniel learned that she was 19 years old, the youngest daughter of Chief Takoda. She'd been out gathering herbs when she'd fallen down a ravine, injuring her ankle and becoming completely lost. She'd spent 2 days trying to find her way home before Daniel found her. She'd been certain she was going to die. When he'd helped her instead of hurting her, It had shocked her deeply. "White men don't help Apache women," she explained in broken English. "White men take, use, kill. You different." "Why?" Daniel didn't have a good answer. Because it was the right thing to do seemed inadequate, but it was the truth. Ayanna studied his face for a long moment, then said something that made Daniel's chest tight. "You, good man. I lucky. Find you." By the 5th day, something had shifted between them. The awkwardness had faded, replaced by a comfortable familiarity. They worked together smoothly, anticipated each other's needs, laughed at their misunderstandings. Daniel found himself looking forward to coming back to the cabin at the end of the day, to seeing Ayanna smile, to hearing about what she'd done while he was gone. It felt, he realized with some alarm, like they actually were married. Like this arrangement that had started as a desperate lie was becoming something real. On the 6th night, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Ayanna spoke to him in careful English. "Tomorrow. My people come. Big ceremony. Many gifts." She paused, searching for words. "If you want, I tell truth. Say we not married. You be free." Daniel looked at her across the fire. Her face was serious, giving him an out, releasing him from this obligation they'd fallen into. He could end this now, could go back to his solitary life, could pretend this week had never happened. But the thought of her leaving made his chest ache in a way he hadn't felt since his parents died. "What do you want?" he asked. Ayanna's eyes met his. "If I tell truth, I bring shame. Father will be angry. I probably never marry. Stay unmarried daughter forever." She took a breath. "But if I not tell truth, you stuck. Married to Apache woman. This make your life hard. White people will hate you. Call you Indian lover. Maybe try to hurt you. So I ask what you want." Daniel realized he was at a crossroads. This was his last chance to escape this situation with his old life intact. After tomorrow, if he went through with the ceremony, there would be no going back. He'd be married to an Apache woman, making him an outcast among his own people, forever changed. He thought about his life before Ayanna, lonely, purposeless, going through the motions of survival without any real joy, working himself to exhaustion every day just to avoid thinking about how empty his cabin felt. And he thought about the last 6 days, coming home to someone who smiled when she saw him, sharing meals and stories, learning a new language, a new culture, feeling connected to another human being in a way he'd forgotten was possible. The choice, when he really looked at it, wasn't difficult at all. "I want to stay married," Daniel said quietly, "if you'll have me." Ayanna's eyes widened. "You sure? You understand what this means?" Daniel nodded. "It means I'm your husband. It means your people become my people. It means my life changes forever." He smiled. "Seems like a fair trade for the happiest week I've had in years." Ayanna stared at him for a long moment, then her eyes filled with tears. She said something in Apache, her voice thick with emotion. Then she translated, "I tell father truth. We not married yet, but I want to be. Truly. If you truly want this." Daniel felt something settle in his chest, like a piece of himself he hadn't known was missing, clicking into place. "I truly want this." They came at dawn, not 12 warriors this time. Over 100 Apache riders, their horses laden with gifts, their faces painted for celebration. Daniel stood outside his cabin, watching them approach, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was real now. This was happening. Ayanna stood beside him, her ankle healed enough to walk without limping, wearing a beautiful dress that some of the women had brought in advance. She looked stunning and terrified and determined. Chief Takode rode at the head of the procession. When he reached the cabin, he dismounted and walked slowly toward Daniel, his expression unreadable. Behind him, the warriors formed a wide circle, witnesses to whatever was about to happen. The chief studied Daniel's face for a long moment. Then he spoke in English, his words careful and clear. "My daughter tells me truth. You not married. You just help her. Give her shelter. Keep her safe." Daniel's heart sank. She'd told him. The lie was exposed. He was about to be humiliated in front of 100 warriors, possibly killed. But the chief wasn't finished. "She also tell me you good man, honorable man, man who choose to marry her truly even when you could walk away. This make you rare. White men usually not honorable when Apache women involved." The chief reached into a leather pouch at his belt and pulled out something that made Daniel's breath catch. A necklace made of turquoise and silver, intricately crafted, obviously valuable. "This belonged to my wife's grandmother," the chief said. "Given to daughters on wedding day. I give to you to give to my daughter if you truly want to be her husband, not because you have to, because you want to." Daniel took the necklace with trembling hands. It was heavier than he expected, warm from the chief's body heat. He turned to Ayana, who was crying silently, and placed it around her neck. "I want to be your husband," he said clearly, in English and then in halting Apache, using the words she'd taught him. The roar that went up from the assembled warriors made Daniel jump. It wasn't angry or threatening. It was celebratory, joyful. They were cheering. The chief clasped Daniel's shoulder, then pulled him into a brief, hard embrace. "Welcome to family," he said simply. What followed was the most overwhelming day of Daniel's life. The Apache ceremony was nothing like the Christian weddings he'd attended. There was singing and dancing, ritual blessings he didn't understand, symbolic exchanges of gifts. The chief placed his hand on Daniel's head and spoke in Apache for several minutes, his voice carrying across the valley. Ayana translated later. Her father had welcomed him into the tribe, given him an Apache name meaning "he who shelters," and promised that as long as Daniel treated his daughter with honor, he would be protected as one of their own. The gifts were staggering. The warriors had brought horses, dozens of them. Fine Apache horses, bred for stamina and speed. They brought weapons, beautifully crafted bows and lances. They brought blankets and pottery and baskets full of dried food. They brought tanned hides and tools and seeds for planting. Each warrior approached, presented his gift, and spoke a blessing in Apache. It took hours. By the end, Daniel's small ranch looked like a trading post, piled high with more wealth than he'd ever owned in his entire life. But it wasn't just material goods. The warriors also brought knowledge. Several stayed behind after the ceremony to teach Daniel Apache horsemanship, hunting techniques, survival skills that could mean the difference between life and death in this territory. The chief's closest advisors spent an evening explaining tribal politics, teaching Daniel which areas were safe to travel and which to avoid, sharing information that white settlers would have killed to obtain. They weren't just accepting him. They were investing in him, making sure he had the skills and resources to protect their daughter and build a good life. As the sun set on that extraordinary day, and the last of the warriors prepared to leave, Chief Dakota approached Daniel one final time. "You surprise me, white man," he said. "Most of your people see us as animals, as obstacles, but you see us as human. You see my daughter as woman worth honoring, not thing to use and discard." Daniel met the chief's eyes. "Sir, all I see is my wife, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure she never regrets choosing me." The chief smiled, a real smile that transformed his weathered face. "Good answer. You do that. We will always be friends. You hurt her." He gestured to the departing warriors. 100 men will come for you. And next time, they not bring gifts. Daniel understood perfectly. "Take care of her," Daniel said. "I mean, I will take care of her." The chief laughed at the language mix-up, clasped Daniel's shoulder one more time, and rode away with his warriors, leaving Daniel and Ayana alone together for the first time as an actual married couple. They stood in the yard surrounded by gifts, watching the dust settle as the riders disappeared into the distance. Then Ayana took Daniel's hand and led him into their cabin. "Our cabin now," she said in English, her pronunciation improving every day. "Our home, our life together." That night, for the first time, they shared the bed as husband and wife, and it felt right in a way Daniel had never experienced before. Not because of physical intimacy, though that would come in time, but because of the simple joy of falling asleep next to someone who chose you, someone who saw past skin color and culture to the person underneath. The months that followed were challenging in ways Daniel had never anticipated. The white settlers in the area were horrified when they learned he'd married an Apache woman. Several former friends stopped speaking to him. Others threatened him, called him traitor, said he'd betrayed his own people. The nearest town posted a notice saying he was no longer welcome in their businesses. Daniel and Ayaya were effectively outcasts from white society. But they found acceptance from unexpected places. The Apache tribe adopted Daniel fully, teaching him their ways, including him in their councils, treating him as one of their own. Mexican settlers, who had their own complicated history with both Apaches and Americans, became allies and trading partners. And slowly, grudgingly, a few white settlers began to see that Daniel's marriage had opened a door that could benefit everyone. Daniel became a mediator, someone who could speak both languages, understand both cultures. When tensions rose between settlers and the tribe, both sides came to him for help. When trade negotiations stalled, he facilitated communication. His ranch became neutral ground, a place where Apache and white could meet safely. It wasn't the life Daniel had imagined for himself. It was better. Ayanna gave birth to their first child 2 years after that extraordinary wedding day, a daughter who they named Hope. She was perfect, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin. The Apache celebrated her birth with traditional ceremonies. Even a few white settlers came to offer congratulations, their prejudices softening in the face of an innocent child. As Daniel held his daughter for the first time, Ayanna sleeping peacefully beside him, he thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment. A crying girl on a ridge, a choice to help instead of walking away, a desperate lie that became unexpected truth. He'd gone from lonely bachelor to married father in the span of 2 years. He'd gained a culture, a family, a purpose beyond mere survival. And it had all started with one simple act of human decency. Chief Dakota visited often, doting on his granddaughter, teaching Daniel the responsibilities of fatherhood from an Apache perspective. The old chief had become more than an in-law. He'd become a true father figure, replacing the parent Daniel had lost. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset over the mountains, the chief spoke thoughtfully. "You know, when I first found you with my daughter, I wanted to kill you." Daniel smiled. "I know. I could see it in your eyes," the chief continued. "But Ayanna spoke truth. She said you were different, said you helped her when you should have walked away, said you honored her when you could have dishonored her. I did not believe, but I watched you that day, watched how you held her, watched your face, saw real care, real respect, so I decided to test you, give you 1 week to prove yourself." Daniel turned to look at the chief. "And? Did I pass?" The chief laughed. "You more than pass. You embrace challenge. Accept consequences of your own kindness. Become part of family, not because you have to, but because you want to. This rare quality, very rare." He placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder. "I glad my daughter get lost that day. Glad she found you. Glad you found each other. Sometimes destiny look like accident, but Apache believe nothing accident. Everything connected. You were meant to help her. She was meant to help you. Together you build bridge between our peoples. This important, more important than you know." Daniel thought about those words as his daughter grew, as his family expanded, as the years passed. He and Ayanna had 4 more children, each one a living symbol of the peace that was possible when people chose understanding over fear. The ranch prospered, partly through Daniel's hard work, partly through the support of the Apache tribe. Trade agreements he facilitated brought wealth to both communities. The region became known as a rare place where white settlers and Apache lived in relative peace. And it was all because one man had stopped to help a crying girl on a ridge. Daniel Crawford lived to be 73 years old. When he died, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of both Apache and white heritage, his funeral was attended by representatives from 3 different Apache tribes and dozens of white settlers who had learned tolerance from his example. Chief Dakota, ancient and weathered, spoke at the service. He told the story of how Daniel had found his lost daughter, how a simple act of kindness had changed the course of multiple lives, how one night of shelter had led to a lifetime of family, how a lie told to save a life had become the truest truth either of them had ever spoken. And when the story ended, the chief said something that perfectly captured Daniel's legacy. He saw humanity when others saw only enemies. He chose compassion when others would choose violence. He built bridges when others built walls. This is what makes a man great, not wealth, not power, but the courage to be kind when kindness is hardest. Ayanna lived another 12 years after Daniel's death, surrounded by the family they'd built together. On her own deathbed, she told her grandchildren about the night she'd gotten lost, about the white man who'd saved her life and then changed it forever. She made them promise to remember that people are not defined by their skin color or their culture, but by their choices, by their willingness to see the humanity in strangers, by their courage to love across boundaries, because that's what Daniel Crawford had done on an October evening in 1849. He'd heard crying and investigated instead of ignoring it. He'd helped an enemy instead of leaving her to die. He'd honored her when it would have been easier to dishonor her, and in doing so, he'd proven that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simplest acts of human decency. One night of shelter. One lie told to save a life. 100 warriors bringing a dowry. It sounded like a fairy tale, but it was true, every word of it, and the lesson echoed through generations, that love can cross any boundary, that family can be found in unexpected places, that sometimes the best things in life come from the moments when we choose courage over fear, compassion over cruelty, and connection over prejudice. Now click on the video on the screen to hear another story of impossible choices in the Old West, where one act of bravery changed an entire community forever.